Okay, so we have a very exciting final session, and the presenters have self-assembled actually a treat for you. It's going to be, you'll see as we go along, it's a little bit untraditional in the best of all possible ways. So each of them is going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to have a little bit of an interactive session. So first I'd like to bring up Lukas Biewald. Come on up. So I met Lukas like a long time ago, even though we have very youthful appearances, I think. And, well, he does. And we were at a conference, it was a very academic conference on crowdsourcing. Lukas showed up. I immediately knew that everything we had learned he knew, and he had learned the hard way from a lot of hard knocks. He started PowerSet. That turned into CrowdFlower, then Figure 8. He's sold 2 very successful companies in the crowdsourcing world and AI world. Grown them. He was the very first person I thought of when crowds and AI came to mind. So he's really. I'm so happy that you've come here to be able to share some of your experience with us.
Do like a 5-minute talk. Yeah. It's really interesting to be here and see all the talks and kind of get this perspective. I feel like I haven't gotten this in a little while. I was telling Nikki, and my background is I started CrowdFlower, which became Figure 8. I'm curious. How many people have anybody have used CrowdFlower Figure 8? Awesome. Cool. I think people are in the academic world. People are kind of surprised to learn that we're essentially like. I think from an academic perspective, a lot like Mechanical Turk, but we tended to focus more on selling to bigger companies, and we actually were probably like an order of magnitude more volume than Mechanical Turk. I think most people would estimate it that way. And then we actually sold to a company that probably even less of you have heard of, maybe called Appen. That actually was even an order of magnitude volume more than us. And so I think, almost all of the literature is around Mechanical Turk, but then I think there's actually, just in terms of sort of economic impact, it's really Appen that's driven the most of this volume of kind of crowdsourcing or outsourcing, whatever you want to call it. And I thought I would say, I was trying to think like what would kind of be interesting to y'all from kind of my perspective. And, I wanted to just kind of point out a couple things that I think people might not realize. Maybe you realize this, but one thing is that this sort of dystopian future that we're talking about, a lot of aspects of it are actually pretty aspirational to people in most of the world. So, if you go to India and you go into, I did this quite a lot of kind of going into places where people are doing business outsourcing or kind of digital work that I think we think like, I think some of the panelists and folks have said seems kind of dystopian. Actually, they I've interacted with them enough to sort of get a sense. I think this is really true. They really aspire to have these jobs. They like these jobs. These are like high status jobs, and you'll hear stories like I vividly remember talking to a woman who was like so grateful for CrowdFlower, which is the company I started, because she was like, I was going to have to marry this guy that I didn't want to marry, and then I started doing this job and I made so much money that I didn't have to marry this guy that I didn't want to marry. And it was like that was so like tangible and specific and just like wow, okay, this really mattered for you. And so I just think it's an important thing to remember, and if you hadn't had the experience of that, I really recommend kind of going and talking to these folks. So I think I think more and more, a lot of this kind of crowdsourcing, what happens is it really levels the playing field globally. So I think outsourcing companies are now doing more things that sort of look like crowdsourcing, and really crowdsourcing, I think, more and more is becoming outsourcing, because with digital stuff, it's so easy now. When I started CrowdFlower, payments were really hard, right? So actually, like paying someone in Africa was tough, and there was a high overhead. And now the payment overhead is almost zero. So you really can, you can send small amounts of money with very little overhead anywhere in the world. And I think that's the biggest effect that you see. You see this happening more and more. So I think that's just something I think you should all be aware of. And then, second point. We should go to the panel, but I think it's I think I'll say another really big experience I had as a computer scientist, and maybe I think Nikki kind of come from that background, maybe some of you don't, but I really kind of imagined when I was kind of imagining CrowdFlower and crowdsourcing, I really framed it as a more of a kind of math problem to deliver kind of high quality data well with lots of people. And I think what I kind of discovered is actually more of an HCI problem in the sense that the interface I think is really by far the most important piece to kind of making this work well. And I think I've talked to lots of other people that have built sort of similar companies. I think everyone kind of discovers this. It's in the interface. It's like the interface matters more than the marketplace dynamics. It matters more than I think anything else in terms of making things function well. But sorry, the one other point I wanted to make was when you run a company like this, like I did with lots of people and customers, there's actually the marketplace dynamics are incredibly powerful, right? So, one thing that you really feel running these companies is you say, well, we'd really like people to get paid more. I mean, I was CEO of CrowdFlower, and I really, really wanted to pay people more money, sincerely. There's business reasons to do it. There's also, it'd feel a lot better to do it. And I know that the folks in all these companies, the Appen CEO feel the same way. But there's this effect here, which is that there's a very small number of customers, and there's just so many people that want to do this work. We actually did lots of things to kind of make it harder to basically sign up and start doing work on our platform because it was just such an overwhelming number of people. It was just really hard to kind of keep us. And so you could say, okay, well, let's put a price floor on things, and we did that, right? We would recommend higher prices. We do all kinds of things to kind of nudge and push people to basically to hire to pay higher amounts of money. But you can imagine, right, there's literally millions of people on the platform that want to do this work. And the customers, I would say they actually don't care as much as the people about the rate. So, but there's just the fact that there's so many fewer customers and so many more workers, I think it's just a very hard, it's a very hard dynamic to push back on. Cool, thanks. All right, thanks.
Okay, should I use that mic or? Okay. So just stand here. Okay, so I'm gonna, in 5 minutes, maybe, try to tell you about one project related to human crowds and AI. And so I'm gonna pick up on some of the points that Lukas raised, and also maybe all the points that Jerry Davis raised in his talk about the Uberization of work. And thinking about AI is actually managing the crowd. So Lukas talked about this challenge of scale when lots of sort of people are sort of flooding into the platform. And one of the ways that, we've been thinking about AI and maybe collective intelligence is that this idea of human computation, that the crowds are actually training the AI. But in this case, the AI is also helping us kind of manage the crowd or make the best use of the crowd. And this has been coming up throughout the conference. So this is what I'm going to pick up on. And I'm most interested in the human experience of this crowd. So I'm also picking up on Mary's talk. What does this work actually look like? How does this user interface that the workers are encountering actually affect their experience? And how do they try to deal with it? And the algorithms that they're interacting with there. And this is all motivated by the Uberization of work. So the fact that we are automating the firm, and AI is replacing many of the management functions in firms today. So, there's this question of what is work actually going to look like? And things like recruiting and task assignment. We can use the results from people in this community to form teams that are best matched in terms of their testosterone levels, and we can moderate their communication so that they don't have any conflict, and evaluate their work, and then know who's the best at which task, and then put them together again. So what does that actually look and feel like? So I'm going to talk about a specific project that I did with Min Kyung Lee, who's here at the conference today, and you should all meet. Where we looked at the experience of Uberization. So Uber and Lyft is the perfect setting setting, we thought, to study this phenomenon because it is this place where algorithms are dynamically assigning the work, they're optimizing who gets what task, they're setting the compensation, and so we wanted to understand what practices sort of emerge when this is the case, and do workers actually cooperate with the algorithm? Are they, sort of conforming to what the algorithm wants them to do, and how does this influence their motivation to get work done? So I already probably used my 5 minutes, so I can't tell you everything that we found, but I'm going to highlight 2 key results that I think are really important and connect with some of the themes that have come through in this conference. And so I should mention, this was a qualitative study where we interviewed workers and drivers. We looked at archival communication in worker forums and also what the company themselves put out. And so we found first that drivers were actively managing their work based on their understanding of the algorithm. So they developed these strategies to retain control. They created workarounds so that they could, have the task that they actually wanted. And these were really interesting. So things like turning off the app when they were in a bad neighborhood because they didn't want to pick anyone up in that neighborhood. Or things like staying in a residential area because they only wanted to do drives from people's homes to the bar. They didn't want to pick up drunk people coming out of the bar at 2 a.m. or whatever. They also looked at the map to actively manage, where to go. So they understood that the algorithm was assigning their work based on proximity to where the rides were coming, and so they would see that, okay, there's too many drivers in that area, so I'm not going to get a ride, and so I'm going to actually go and move to a different location so I can be more likely to get a ride and get a higher paying ride. And they had learned over time. So they developed this, in Lyft specifically, this idea that the longer they were logged in, then they would get kind of requests far away because their app was just trying to get them some work, so they weren't just sitting around. And so they would frequently log off and on to kind of avoid those kinds of tasks that were really far from where they were sitting. So they kind of learned how the algorithm works. And just yesterday, this sort of came to fore. So the workers are actually using this understanding of the app their algorithm in a collective way to retain control over, or almost protest. It's this new form of collective action against the platform. So I don't know how many of you saw this story, but the idea that drivers are actually trying to manipulate surge pricing by collectively turning off the app at the same time so that the prices spike. And Uber's not happy about that. And why? Okay, so the first point that I want to raise is that the workers actually know, or actively trying to figure out how the algorithms that are managing them work, and they're using that to retain control. The second point is this point that Mary raised. So online forums are incredibly important here, and that is where socialization is happening and the sense making of how the algorithm actually worked. That was where this was happening. So we looked at all these Facebook groups that drivers were using as these sort of virtual break rooms where they actually talk about the work, how the work gets done. This is where they learned how to be a new driver. This is where they talked about how the algorithm worked, or how changes that were happening in the algorithm. These are just a couple of cute examples, like the Lyft and Uber drivers break room. There are local ones, so you had to prove you're a driver in there because Uber is trying to figure out what people are talking about. But this is incredibly important for us to keep in mind. So these kind of communities are a really important tool, and they're basically compensating for things that aren't happening in the platform themselves. And so that means at that. The other question is how do these careers evolve? And so the drivers are actually actively going to these forums to share knowledge. They're also now posting these YouTube videos that are basically training each other or sharing information and updates about how the app is working. This is the rideshare professor. So maybe this is the future of all of our jobs in this Uberized feature that Jerry was talking about, where we're basically going on YouTube and sharing like, okay, these are strategies for how to basically perform this kind of work effectively. So it teaches people the two-phone workaround, like how to use the driver and rider app at the same time and stuff like that. Okay, so all of this raises a bunch of interesting issues about AI-enabled organizations. We talked a little bit about the paper about algorithmic transparency and how much transparency workers should actually have about how the algorithm works, and the surge pricing kind of strike shows one trade-off with that. Min has looked a lot at this in her follow-up work, and so I encourage you to look at her work on this, sort of these trade-offs there. But in a perfect world, the workers would know, okay, how does the algorithm work, and they'd be able to choose those tasks that are most interesting and meaningful to them. They'd be able to do this really enriched form of self-directed career development with all these great resources where people are not necessarily trying to take advantage of them. And find mentors and get good training for how they're doing this work. And they would have great forums for community building and collective action versus these ones that they just have to cobble together. And these algorithms would take into account the cross-platform nature of their work, because these people are not just working on one platform, they're working on lots of platforms at the same time and switching between them, and they're kind of doing that to themselves optimize, like where's the best price right now, where should I go now? And so that is something that we have to actively take into account and consider. And so this is related to, I think, some of the points that Melissa brought up around optimizing locally and then not thinking globally. Okay, I think I went way over my 5 minutes. Thanks.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about a product that we built. Similar to Lukas, I've been in the business of developing new products as part of the work we do. This is a product that we built when I was at Microsoft. We spent about 2 years working on this, so I'll give you the 5-minute summary of what we learned. So the motivation for this particular product was we talked to a lot of information workers about what are the kinds of things that they hate doing. You probably are familiar with an example like this one, where somebody sends you an email and says, hey, what day and time works for a quick meeting? And then you reply, oh yeah, I'm wide open on Monday after checking your calendar app or whatever. And then the other person replies, oh, actually, I'm traveling that day. How about Wednesday at 10 a.m.? And you go back and check on your app, and you're like, oh, I'm actually not available at this time. And then you're like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm busy at the time, and what about this time? So you go back and forth for many days, perhaps, just trying to set up this meeting. And so there's tons of solutions out there for that. There's Doodle, there is Google Calendar sharing with others. But the reality is that we all have experienced this, and yet we continue to spend time on this. We survey about 100 people. I'm missing the x-axis, but it's like 40% of people reported that scheduling meetings was the one thing that they wish most to delegate to others, to not deal with that. And if you're familiar with the way executives deal with this, they have assistants. And now, actually, I was talking to Walter. He has an assistant as a professor, which is pretty cool, but very few people have that. And so when that happens, you can delegate this thing to someone else. And that's kind of what we wanted to build. So what we did is that we built this scheduling assistant that you can summon at any given point in any email conversation. And so here's an example. You can email somebody or reply to somebody else's email, and CC, in this case, the name of the assistant is Cortana at calendar.help. And then when that happens, Cortana takes over, just like if you had your own assistant. And from then on, you don't need to be involved in the back and forth of checking your calendar, because Cortana has access to your calendar. And not only that, but you can enable this to schedule meetings with a variety of different people. And so we built this product. We actually built a prototype of this in a month. And we were like, oh, this is super easy. Part of our goal was to go over that list of tasks and kind of start automating others this way. But the reality is that it didn't work that easily. And it took us 2 years to have a product that now is available. If you go to calendar.help, you can sign up for this product. It's part of Microsoft Office now. But it took a lot of time to do it. I can show you a quick video on how this is executed, kind of representing some of the things that I was describing. The idea, again, is that you can just copy the assistant on an email. So that's the organizer, sends an email to the attendee and the assistant from then on takes over the conversation, goes back and forth proposing times using natural language, and once everybody agrees on a time, the assistant will send the final invitation to everyone. And so one of the things, as I was describing, is that for very simple meetings, this is very easy to automate. However, you all are familiar with the complexities of things. Like some people don't block out times in their calendar because they don't do it. They just block out specific meeting times. People have different hierarchies in the organization. So if you're trying to schedule a meeting with a client, you probably want to take any time that they have available. And so there's a lot of complexities of this. And this is why when we started to build this system, we couldn't rely on completely automatic solutions. So we went to similar to CrowdFlower kind of solutions and started to involve humans in the loop. And so inspired by the work that Walter and many other people in this community have done, we built a kind of workflow that I can describe at very high level. Oops. That this workflow describes how the product was implemented at a very high level. So on the one end, we have this simple tier of kind of off-the-shelf natural language processing libraries that we use to parse the emails that we got and identify things like when somebody wants to meet, maybe the location and things like that. And we did our best with that. But again, that doesn't work all the time. And so what we did is that then we broke the process into small tasks, like the ones you see on CrowdFlower or mTurk, and then we gave those tasks to workers that we hire. We hire them through a vendor that provides the service to Microsoft. And then we knew that even though we had designed this perfectly, or seemingly perfectly workflow, there were many new scenarios that we couldn't account for. And so for that, we had this third tier. So we had actual professional assistants, admin assistants, who will take over the process in case any of these things didn't work out. And so the goal was that, for version 1, we actually didn't have any of these tier 1 and tier 2. We had only tier 3. So in essence, we were delegating just to an assistant like any, traditional process will be. But over time, the fact that we had that third tier will allow us to identify new workflows and break those into smaller kind of tasks. And then those tasks, when we had enough data, we were able to then automate them. The last time I checked with some of the folks that continue to work on this at Microsoft, we have about 70% of the tasks are completely automatic, and the other ones are a combination of this tier 2 and tier 3. So you can read more about this both in an HBR article that we have, as well as a Kai paper that we published. But this is kind of like the very simplified version of this. Happy to discuss more about the details of this. And I guess just to kind of close, there's a lot of complexities in doing this kind of work, both from a privacy perspective, as well as the nature of what does it mean for assistants to do this kind of work, what does it mean to break these complex processes into smaller micro tasks. But I think this points in a direction that we've heard throughout the conference on how these kinds of things are executed. And from a perspective of a builder or somebody who is building these kind of systems, it's interesting to see how the sausage is made in some ways, and how we can make better systems, both for the people using these systems as well as for the people working inside these systems. So with that, I want to give it to Walter.
Okay, I don't have a title slide. Didn't get the memo. Maybe I should have mentioned it to my assistant. I'm actually going to go immediately off script, so that maybe works for the best. I will say that I really like the example of scheduling, in part because while my assistant is amazing, some undisclosed percentage of the time, the back and forth to try to find a time ends in her walking into my office and going, wow, they're being a pain in the ass. How can I possibly find a time if they won't budge? And it turns into this more complicated social problem, right, that does still require human intelligence or human ability to reason about those things. So I'm going to go a little bit more meta on my presentation here. I'll show one example, but I want to start with the idea that in any situation where we have to be able to reason about social interactions or the ways in which people adapt and interact with their environment, including other people, including other objects, and complexities, we're always going to have some a gap between what we can represent and what we can understand with technology and this social world. And I think Ackerman, in some work from 2000, very nicely clarifies that one of the core challenges of computer-supported cooperative work is in bridging this gap, this socio-technical gap. And so while this is a nice fundamental problem, a nice outlining of a fundamental problem, what we've seen in human computation and crowdsourcing is potentially a new way to think about bridging this gap. And it's because we can think about paid crowds as a way to, in human computation, as a way to algorithmically introduce human effort, human insight into these processes so that we can try to adapt to what the computer can actually do itself. And when I say computer computation here, I do include all the fanciest AI you can throw at problems today, because you still have very rigid representations. Even with neural networks, you still have a lot of unspecified information or very case-specific information that ends up getting encoded into the system, whether that be, used to be features, now it's a bunch of hyperparameters which are even less visible or understandable to us. So let me give one quick example of what this actually looks like to take people into the process as a way to bridge this gap. And I'll use Apparition as this example. So Apparition is a sketch prototyping tool that we've published a line of work on over the past few years. The idea is that you could come into this interface as a designer, sketch anything you want, and describe it out loud as you would to another person who's watching you sketch out something on a whiteboard. And within seconds, it comes to life. And in fact, what we can do is, this is in follow-up work on a system called Sketch Express, if this plays. Maybe. There we go. All right, so this is just an example of some behind-the-scenes interaction that workers can go through. And they can actually demonstrate behaviors based on whatever the request was. Obviously, we started with a slightly higher fidelity starting point here. But they can repeatedly encode demonstrations and then enact different playback scenes by reconstructing different sets based on the description. So if you want the boat to go over the waves and kind of follow the choppy ocean here, you can do that with only a few steps. And what you can then do is create these more complex interactions. Oh, now it wants to play instead of go to the next slide. Okay, so within minutes, you can create these more complex interactions here, prototyping a version of Flappy Bird. So what you don't see here is that there's a user pressing arrow keys in the background, and this is the view from a worker who has already configured this task. So they have a few controls, and they're able to respond to those key presses and even show the appropriately timed death animation and game over here. So over time, what we're doing is we're taking these very nebulous, sketch plus natural language descriptions that might make sense to another person, but really don't or can't make sense to a system. Imagine I can sketch anything I want here. I can invent things that don't exist. I can invent things that certainly the system has no training data on. And we're mapping that back down to a series of behaviors or animations that are triggered at a specific time in response to a specific input. And then we can actually learn how to automate these systems over time using that input. And we can't do this with one person. It takes a lot of parallel efforts. We have to have mechanisms for coordinating multiple people doing this at once, but we can actually keep up in real time to the point where the average latency between a described action and the first demonstration when you actually interact with the system is less than 3 seconds. So we now prototype on the fly. Okay, this thing really likes only being in one mode at a time. So we can prototype on the fly and then over time encode that knowledge into the system so that it can get better at this. And actually over the years we have a lot of examples of how to take different complex problems like reasoning about general rules or meaning of described behaviors, dealing with situated references, so how we ground language by sharing artifacts in a joint scenario, using interactional context. So we had a deployed conversational system that's completely open-ended, let you hold any conversation that you can hold with another person, but actually worked by having groups of people constantly coming and going over time, and yet still had to maintain consistency and coherence over the course of an interaction. And in some more recent work, actually thinking about anticipation, understanding intent in different scenarios, being able to plan ahead by a little bit so that I'm ready for something that is likely to happen a little bit in advance so we can respond even faster. So one of the fun pieces of this is not only can we start to bridge some of these gaps, we're not able to do this perfectly, but able to start bridging some of these gaps using human computation and crowdsourcing. We're able to do this in real-time interactive scenarios, and we're actually able to reach superhuman performance. So the work on Bolt actually introduced the idea that you could get human responses in 2 milliseconds, anticipating what would happen in just a fraction of a second from now. So you overcome things like people's physical ability to respond to a stimulus within milliseconds, so that 2 orders of magnitude faster than anybody physiologically could be. And it's by using groups that are mediated by AI, and in that case actually using some the underlying models of the world that the AI agent is using to guide human effort. So we've seen at the starting point, you can think about a lot of the work that Figure 8 has done as producing data that then trains machines. Laura talked about the idea that you might actually be getting tasks in a lot of these scenarios from machines or management handed off as an organizational component. Then you have tasks that actually require some interaction over a period of time. So Andreas's example of the calendar is a great one. And then finally, this more generalized idea that we use computation and crowdsourcing to scale to interactive settings. A lot more flexibility. This starts to look like, if we scale this up beyond small teams, this starts to look to me a lot like organizations, right? We want to be able to say, here's something that operates on a moment-to-moment basis, can interact with other agents, it adapts to the complexity of the world around it, and yet is made of people, maybe people and machines. But it is fundamentally a way to take a computational lens to human effort. So in a perfect world, what this all enables, I'm going to prompt my co-panelists. So in a perfect world, what this enables is technology that responds fluidly and naturally to any interaction we want to have, even when we are interacting with other people around us, with our environment, or people remotely. And that's a pretty optimistic utopian future, I think.
However, I guess one of the challenges that we've seen, at least in our product, in Calendar.health, was that if you are delegating tasks to people, some of the information may leak, right? So imagine you are one of the crowd workers working on some of these calendaring tasks. How do you prevent this information from being available to everyone? So here is the example that Walter and I were thinking about, like, what if you are passing by one of the Calendar.help users and like, hey, good luck on your date. Like, wait, how do you know about my date? So that's one potential challenge and dystopian view. But I think...
But wait, Andreas, there is research, systems like CrowdMask and WhereMail that has looked at how to maintain privacy even when groups are engaged in these underlying computational tasks. So maybe this can be avoided.
Right. So I guess part of the idea for us when building this product is that we knew about this kind of work, right? That you can obfuscate some of this information. And more broadly, I guess we were excited about the idea that from the perspective of the person using the system, now you have like these superhuman abilities to execute things that otherwise you couldn't do. In some ways, you're carrying with you this on-demand crowd that can help you execute things. Now, I guess the question also is like, what about those people who are behind these APIs?
Yeah, those APIs are actually powered by, actual people or crowd workers who are training them, helping them learn how to respond to these tasks intelligently, and that work is actually very repetitive and not necessarily rewarding. And is the future of work going to be all of us basically doing this task? Or the last person in McDonald's is the way that we thought of the entrepreneur kind of person that Jerry was talking about. So a less rewarding potential version of that.
Or even worse, There are no people at all. And to avoid ending this on a negative note, we're going to now move to CI 2039, which was so optimistically foreshadowed yesterday at dinner. And we wanted to start the conversation there about how these human AI systems could lead to wonderful future interactions, or this dystopian last person working at McDonald's, following the timers that the machine sets for us, and how we can avoid that collectively.
All right, so we have some time for questions. I think we could set these questions maybe in 2039 as well. So I am curious, one theme that has come up over the last 20 years of all of your fantastic research and companies affecting the world since 2019 was, it seems like all of you are talking about understanding and lack of understanding between the AI and the people, right? So it could be that calendars don't understand this, complex socio-technical architectures that surround our negotiations. It could be around drivers trying to understand how the AI system works. We know that sometimes it's actually good to understand each other, and sometimes you don't want to have visibility into your coworkers' pay, right, or things like that. So what have we learned in the last 20 years that have solved a lot of our problems about understanding, and when these two systems should understand each other or not? What if you were to reverse speculate?
Yeah, I think one thing that Jerry's talk made me think about is the idea that if we were to have a worker-owned version of Uber or a worker-owned version of Calendar.help, what will that look like? And I think part of what I will be interested to think about is 20 years from now, if we were to have the ability for the workers that are working on these platforms to determine the algorithms that are serving not just their tasks, but also serving the services to the customers, I think that will make it a lot easier for people to encode decisions that are about labor decisions in the code that is running the systems. A few years after we worked on this project, we also tried to work on a worker-owned version of Uber, and we reached out to a bunch of Uber drivers, and it was interesting to talk to them because they didn't see themselves as people owning, and they were not interested in kind of owning this thing, partly because they were not exposed to even the idea of this. And it did make me think that it's not just about the ability to learn how to code, but also the ability for people to think beyond just their current state of mind. And I think that's something that will be useful, 20 years from now, to think about how to not just think about the code part, but also to think about, how to empower people to go beyond just being below the API, and to go above as well.
Yeah, so one of the things that I guess we're hypothetically the advances that we've discovered in the last 20 years. Yeah, we're in 2039 now. So yeah, one of the things that we figured out, hopefully, is I think what you're talking about is how to kind of evolve or support career development in this kind of world where some of these jobs are getting automated away, and it's happening pretty rapidly. But also the jobs are evolving as the algorithms evolve, and so as the platforms themselves are being developed. I think one of our speakers yesterday brought this up, but they're sort of have to train on demand because of that. So we figured that out now. So we have intelligent systems that help support career development and help these workers figure out what they need to do next. And
I wonder about the, benefits of some of the transparency that comes as a result of algorithmically driven work. The interesting lines I was told by somebody more senior in the academic hierarchy was that they once talked to a provost or a dean or something, and they said, well, wait a minute, I can't figure out how this system really works, the mechanism underneath. And the person looked at them back and they said, you're not supposed to be able to figure it out. That keeps people from gaming it, right? You should just go do what we are ostensibly here to do and don't worry about how it actually works. And I wonder if when you can game these platforms, right, that takes something away from the experience or adds a burden to the experience that we're not really thinking through. So maybe intentionally making these systems more difficult to understand and yet still kind of incentive compatible in some higher level way is actually a perk, maybe that we will not have figured out by 2039, I don't know.
And this is one of the challenges and potentially a dystopian view of this is as we create algorithms to mediate more aspects of organizations that if we don't understand how they work, we may be encoding, I mean, this came up yesterday as well, but we may be encoding bias that exists in the system. So our utopian view is that these algorithms actually equalize. Like this is one of the, issues, one of the benefits that some drivers brought up to us, and you might have heard drivers bring up, is that they don't have to rely on like a politically corrupt dispatcher anymore. The algorithm is supposedly equally providing access to everyone. We know that's not necessarily true, and there are still inequities, but if, can we design around them, or are we going to keep kind of like trying to design around them? So we talked about there's this recent study around the gender pay gap in Uber. It exists there as well because women actually drive slower than men, and they're less risk-taking. And so you could try to build that into the system and say, okay, we're going to compensate for that. Or we're going to actually penalize men for speeding. Or so yeah, that's one take on that.
Yeah, there's a question. Sorry. No, I was actually just thinking like about algorithmic transparency as an author of like one of these algorithms that tries to like incentivize people to do quality work. We started off with a lot of transparency, and we slowly I think had less transparency because one thing is if you Google CrowdFlower, you Google Figure 8, what you'll find is mostly like videos and ebooks and things like that of kind of how to game the system, and so it sort of felt like we're giving people like a blueprint to game it, and so I don't know. It's I think we really like the idea of transparency, but then there was like pressure to move away from it just to keep the thing functioning.
I'm curious, what's an example of something that people were gaming?
Well, we would have like these sort of like levels to reward people, kind of coming back and doing good work, and also we would reward people kind of like matching what other people would do, and so people would do these kind of coordinated things where they'd kind of like all log in at the same time and all do like matching work on a vulnerable task, or the lengths people went through to kind of spoof IP addresses was like spectacular, right? Because a lot of people would be like, okay, I want like, I don't want just people that speak Portuguese. I want like Brazilian Portuguese speakers, and there would be like a lot of tasks, but you had to be in Brazil, so so I guess things like that, and we would often try to figure out like real language skills, because Google Translate, you can actually kind of fake language skills like reasonably well, but you don't like what you get with that. Yeah.
Hi, I'm just curious with this, thinking about how these kinds of rules for self-ownership, right, or community ownership might evolve. Are there lessons from the open source movement, from Mozilla and Linux and things like that, where we can see how that percolated up, or we can see how that's moved through? Are there lessons there, particularly for those of you that came out of coding communities? Do you see parallels there that could be, because the flip side of this is that in contrast to the optimistic message there, I responded a lot to Lukas's earliest comment about the amount of supply fighting against the ability to organize against the countervailing capitalistic forces. So I'm really curious to know what we could see out of Mozilla and Linux, which are successful open source activities.
But important to note they're increasing the kind of industry funding. Yeah, and so.
I think one of the challenges that I see of that approach is that those projects came out of people who had a significant amount of flexibility, both financial and education, I guess. People who were coding like Linux and things like that. Well, like you couldn't expect that to happen from people who are like scraping by and trying to just get at the next task on Uber. So that was the main challenge as we started to expand beyond calendaring and look at, like, for example, we talked to this organization that does domestic work in Seattle. We reach out to them and we are like, oh, there is this area will be disrupted like 5 years from now probably by some Uber of domestic work. We should work together on making an app. And it was surprisingly difficult to get it. And part of it is that I think the transition from being kind of passive not being like the people who own the means of production and to becoming that was something that was the biggest barrier, I guess, for actually getting to implement something like this. I mean, I think it's definitely a worthwhile thing to do, but I think it will have to be done not like the Linux approach, where it's like bottom up, but more through organizations that are already established. And that also comes with challenges, right? Because some of those organizations could be politically, challenging in some ways. But I think that probably has more promise than expecting some Uber driver to be like, oh, I'm going to learn Python and then code this and put it in AWS and, support it for millions of users. It's actually really expensive to do all those things, and I wouldn't expect that to happen.
So to second a point about people who are maybe better resourced, either in terms of training or financially, being the drivers of a lot of these communities, and I think actually something that Jerry pointed out as well, if you go back to like some of the work by Peter Drucker, right, he points out that innovation doesn't happen when you're fighting for your life, right, and that makes a lot of sense. But it does say that, at a certain comfort level, basically, you have the freedom to take those risks and to contribute to new communities that maybe either don't exist or won't directly benefit you as a contributor. And I think that's something important to keep in mind for structural reasons, right? How do we facilitate this innovation? We have to make sure that people aren't risking their entire livelihood, or what was the exact scenario? Lose their kids and live in their car.
I do think that one opportunity for people in academia is to work on these problems, because I feel like industry probably does not have the right incentives all the time, and also some markets may not even be big enough to be valuable as a business model. And then on the other hand, the people, as we discussed, the workers also don't have the bandwidth to do it. But I do suspect that people in the academy both have the skills and potentially the kind of goodwill to try to build these sort of systems. Like even Netscape, I think, came out, like Mosaic, the browser, came out of a university. And a lot of this software that now we use has come out of environments like that. So that's my hope, that I think some of this work will come from environments like universities.
Ben.
Thanks for the presentations. Back in 2019, the big labor service platforms grew so large because of the two-sided network effects, where there was a high critical mass of both service providers and buyers that were needed to get in any platform, get it started. And each additional participant further cemented the leader's role by making that network more valuable. Can you tell us again the story of how those network effects became less important or overwhelmed by something else, and how those powerful oligopolies got broken up?
Yes, we learned from open source now. I think one of the things that people have been talking about is this idea of like self-governed, like cooperative platforms that the workers themselves own, and that's kind of an interesting model that worked. But I mean,
another possibility, maybe the governments could provide this infrastructure. So imagine the city of Pittsburgh builds their own white label version of Uber and then partners with the city of New York, and then they work on a federated version of this that you open the same app no matter where you are, and it connects to the local version of this. So it starts to sound a little bit like the infrastructure for electricity or water and things like that. So maybe that's a thing that taxis could pay for. That's where we're going to be working.
So I'm going to try and stay in the future, because I'm wondering if in the future, two things. If we don't necessarily take gaming algorithms as a sign of nefarious action, but more people trying to meet their needs. Like it suggests that we didn't build it right because we weren't considering what it was that people wanted and needed. And that maybe there's conflict about the multiple stakeholders in the mix. So I'm very much thinking of Min and Laura's work here. But then the other thing that comes to mind, and this is maybe a gentle pushback call out, is that when we denigrate something like doing service work like McDonald's, we might not be thinking about in the future that if it's worker owned and somebody's providing a service, somebody wants that service. And so I just would really encourage all of us to think about there's dignity in any kind of work that somebody does. What makes it diminished is when we diminish it, right? So it feels like opportunities to think about. We've got a lot of evidence that tells us there's value in information services. The workers themselves take value from it. Often when I hear people say, God, I would never want to do that really rote, boring work, what I'm hearing them say is, I would never want to do that work, but I happily appreciate it when somebody else does it and they just forgot the thank you, right?
Yeah, no, good point on the second one there. I should clarify, we went back and forth a little bit on the food service example, but the dystopian part of that was supposed to be just that the person is running back and forth, doing only what the computer has beeped at them to do, not having any agency in that job, not the role itself.
And the utopian version of that is that you could run a restaurant with one single person, right? So, and I think when I was talking to Jeff about Wikipedia and the bots that happened there, it kind of reminded me of that, where some people were doing this rote or this very specific kind of work on Wikipedia, and they realized, oh wait, I could automate that for myself, and then they built this bot, and now it's providing a great service. And so in some ways, it's like thinking of the person doing that work being augmented by these automatic processes and allowing them to do more than just what they could do by themselves. That's an interesting approach. I wanted to follow up on your comment about people who are circumventing some of the norms or rules of platforms. And I do struggle with that a lot, because when working on platforms like MTurk and so on, the default is that people are going to try to do the least amount of work or even cheat if possible. And you probably talk more with these people, and you know more. I mean, obviously the reason is probably because they have limited time and they want to earn the max amount of money that they can, which I will do if I was there. But the question is what do you do as a platform? And will you try to solve world inequality first before opening these platforms, or will you try to just focus on your platform and address that? I don't know, it feels too idealistic to be real.
Something that might be useful in this entire room is that just from the data that we have, the number of, the always on, who are really the bulk of who are doing your tasks, and it's a pretty concentrated group, they're mostly invested in being able to get a job tomorrow. So they're pretty invested in the quality and do a lot of self-policing of making sure that there's high quality so that you will keep coming back. There's certainly a group of folks who are like, if you're stupid enough not to put some standards in your survey so that I can just game you, they might take advantage of you. The workers themselves will stop that from being a perpetual action against somebody who ever comes back, because they want you to have a good experience. So treat them more like workers, because that's what they mostly are, rather than adversarial black hats coming at you, because that's not what they are. They want you there as much as you need them. So I get why people default to that, because odds are pretty good you might have had an unscrupulous person scam you. Promise you, they've been scammed by far more unscrupulous people than you will ever be in your lives.
Just a public service announcement for these people. A single negative review can actually have very lasting consequences when the honest signals are so difficult to come by. So yeah, just building on that.
Yeah, I guess two kind of points around that add context. I think too often we talk about gaming algorithms as if every single person in this room wasn't doing it for something. Right now, right? We game algorithms all the time. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Fair reward is an algorithm that you're trying to work within, right? Compensation for work works like that. That's not necessarily inherently bad. The other thing is, I have heard a lot of people talk about Mechanical Turk workers as if they were somehow less reliable or more malicious than your standard undergrad participating in a study. And And yet I think the two different demographics are talked about very differently, which is maybe telling. In my experience, it goes the other way around. People who are doing this and self-identify as workers, on these platforms tend to be much more invested in the quality of their own work.
Just to add to that, I guess, yeah, I guess that's part of the reason that we think that a more holistic view of the motivations of some of these workers and their experience can help design better platforms like this. Yeah, if you have a sense that, okay, work consistency, which I love that comes out so well in your book, but that's one of the motivations. You can design a better algorithm, basically. Yeah.
Thank you. Coming back to the example of Uber, so how feasible it could be for Uber to let the drivers customize the algorithm in a way that they want the algorithm to function, and it doesn't necessarily they don't necessarily need to know how to manipulate the algorithm, how to code, but just by filling out an easy survey and having some options and customize the algorithm in a way that they really want to function, and how it ultimately impacts the company's goal in terms of the customer satisfaction, not maximizing the utility of the drivers.
I mean, I think they try to do that at some level, like in terms of letting people put in preferences in the direction they want to go, for a long trip. They're starting to add things like that, but I think it's hard because it's not clear to what extent they have a view on some of the issues from the driver side. So yeah, I think taking those things into account. I mean, it's like if you have to codify the elements of the work at some level to do that, and then there may be other things that you're not taking into account. So it's like this iterative cycle, I think. In doing that, I don't know. So yeah, maybe we'll invent more platforms that can self-evolve their own design, but there may always be things that are not accounted for yet.
Maybe one more thing on that. Maybe one more thing on that. Here in the year 2039, workers on these platforms all have agents that they have trained to go act on their behalf when it comes to negotiating a deal. So instead of just turning off the app and turning it back on at a more opportune time, as rumors had it, they did it back in 2019. Instead, they can start to describe their preferences over repeated interactions with the platform, and then hand that kind of optimization between the two parties off to another agent entirely. I hear actors and other forms of work used to have similar roles.
Hi. So here it's 2039. I look this young because it's actually synthetic skin. You can't know the difference, but it works great. And so it turns out that the future of work is that there's no work anymore. And all these problems with workers that we were anticipating turned out to be totally transient, right? And so how, to what extent were we able to circumvent the challenge with that? And to what extent were we able to turn activities that were previously considered work and transform it into this weird new category that stays, it's between work and play, and is both economically valuable and intrinsically valuable?
First off, congratulations on hitting our Easter egg slide.
You were expecting this.
Do you want to?
Well, I mean, I think that's interesting. I was thinking about that in why haven't we seen that already? Because we thought about this idea a long time ago, maybe 15 years ago. Why can't we turn these kinds of, these low-level tasks that maybe people don't enjoy into something intrinsically motivating that they'll just want to do, not even for pay. And I mean, part of the issue is the challenge in designing the task itself, even the interface of the task. I think that's something that you brought up, but it takes a lot of work, I don't know, to structure it in a way that people enjoy. But there are all these things that are happening outside of the platform too.
it might be that the necessity of the role not being something that feeds more people on the planet anymore, right? Means that the production from that activity just needs to be enough to offset the cost of turning it into a fun activity. Yeah. Right? So I do think that people want to be productive. I think I personally don't know what I would do with myself if I absolutely had nothing plausibly productive at all. I could just sit around, do whatever I want. I was just about to say, I think it would involve, a lot of frosting and probably some minor bone loss, if you've seen the movie. I would be right in the chair next to them. But it wouldn't necessarily be very fulfilling. And it's also not necessarily fulfilling. Like, it doesn't mean that I just want to do something, right? That idea that I can help with something, I'm not just sitting here as a lump, is nice, right? And I think that's a general kind of human characteristic.
Yeah, I want to suggest that connects back to two important things that we've, by and large, not discussed here, but that are intrinsically related to why people come to work, which is the sense of teamwork, like trust in the team and the bonds that exist there, and also the meaning of the work itself, right? The purpose of what you're doing, which Hanno talked about yesterday a little bit, but I think these two things are key in bridging that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on it. Like, there's this one big thing missing from a lot of these platforms is this social interaction that is a lot of what people find joy out of in their work. The other is that people adapt their work, right, to figure out what's meaningful to them or craft their job in a way that we can't necessarily anticipate in the design, or they're not able to anticipate necessarily in the design of these platforms. So, yeah, we need to keep that in mind, even for the most routine jobs. People,
So maybe I'll end with a riff on this question. So, in some ways, as a thought experiment, there are many, many goals that we have not kind of succeeded at as a society, or as a race of interplanetary species we talked about earlier when Nosh was saying things. World hunger, world peace, right? Like, there are a lot of things that we could work towards that I think everyone, or you would find value in at least one of these things. It doesn't seem like we're solving these things anytime soon, but if there was no kind of this type of work, there would probably still be goals we could agree on that we would be motivated by. Maybe the problem is that we don't have an incentive mechanism to organize people towards those goals. And so, how would you, let's say that all this work was taken away, and what kind of incentive mechanisms or coordination structures would you use to get people to solve all of the world's problems?
leaderboard.
I agree with that.
Well, that will only work if your testosterone levels are high.
Exactly. Yeah, we did talk about that. There's a robot that's going to come by and give you.
What do you think's in the cups?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And are things like, our social motivation is going to be enough for that? Yeah, collective identity.
I do feel like it's an interesting call for this community to explore. And I think yesterday, Nikki and I and others were talking about, like, okay, we know all these problems, like, what can we do next? And I do see a lot of potential in what could be done, both in academia or like in the non-profit sector. Because in some ways, like, companies like Uber and others demonstrated the feasibility of the user experience and the marketplace in some ways, and maybe now it's time to build a different version that is more amenable to other business models that could come not from industry per se.
I guess I'm kind of glad. I'll say this kind of unformed thought that I've had for a while, which is, I think there's a lot of concern about the people doing kind of the work below the API. I think you called it, and I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think a lot of these people are vulnerable in a lot of different ways. But I think the biggest vulnerability right now in this moment is actually that a lot of these things that people are automating is on a path to be completely automated, right? And I think that it's funny because I think like it's harder to kind of point to like one company or one thing to like pinpoint to complain about. And it's also kind of harder to know what to do with that. But I think that is sort of the biggest, in my view, kind of the biggest issue that we're going to face in the next 10 years.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the interesting